So thank you, Bronwyn, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's so exciting to see that many countries in a single room. And I hope that this is the last of the presentations today before we break into parallel sessions when everyone will have a chance to participate. So very much looking forward to hearing all of your voices on this issue of gender and WASH, and also on the many other topics that will be covered. So thank you for acknowledging Bruce. Bronwyn, I'd also like to thank Bruce. We interrogated the monitoring and evaluation system for lots of different angles to do with gender, and that's yielded some of the results that you'll see here today. So thanks, Bruce. I guess another preface before presenting some of the results is to say the fund-wide view of information and evidence about what's going on in the many countries is only one view of the many things that all of you are involved in implementing. And so you should take it as that, yeah? It's one view. It can give us a certain insights. It can raise certain questions. It will never properly capture all the extent of the work that's being done. And so I know that I had to choose certain things to highlight. There's so many other stories that could be told from the same data. So just to say, it's great that we're able to share those with one another, and not only to just look at this fund-wide perspective. Good if I can move on, but it's not moving on. That's okay. So a quote from the Special Rapporteur for water, the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, points us to at least one gender issue in relation to water and sanitation that's been, I guess, well looked at, thought about over many years. It's still very central and important to our thinking. But I guess I put it forward at the beginning of this presentation to say this is one thing that we should be thinking about, which is about women's participation in decision-making and planning, and how that then affects the sorts of WASH services that are offered and that are available over the long term. But there are many, many other angles to thinking about gender and WASH together, and hopefully this presentation will highlight some of those other angles as well. So the gender trend in WASH, I've drawn a maybe more than exponential curve here. If you look over history, there have been discussions around the intersection of these two areas for a long time. So the Dublin Principles were about a realisation of women's central role in water resources and water resource management, but a recognition of that same point that they were being left out of decision making. Then in 2010, when we had the reaffirmation of the human right to water and sanitation, that pointed us to the idea of non-discrimination. So that means those services need to be for everyone. They need to be acceptable. The privacy needs to be acceptable. The safety, the dignity, so many different angles of WASH services became important in terms of non-discrimination. And that again points us to some of the gender aspects of WASH. And then we have the Sustainable Development Goals and the Leave No One Behind, which also points us in that same direction. And also we have the SDG 5, which is about gender equality and which has its own set of targets, which if you look at the intersection of those and WASH, you can find many points of synergy and places where we can achieve or look to achieve both sets of sustainable development goals if we think about building that thinking into our processes from the beginning. And lastly, in these current times, there's lots of activity around gender and WASH. As we've heard, and Michael mentioned this morning, the next fund that will follow this is going to have gender equality and social inclusion as central and embedded in the fund. And we have a framing paper that was authored for the high-level panel for water. So again, Michael mentioned that panel. Another area where Australia is making a contribution is to say, hey, gender and women and girls in this picture is important, and that needs to be recognised at the international level. And then here we have a journal, which is a gender and development journal, and their main topic, this just came out this month, is WASH. So the field of gender equality and more broadly is becoming more and more interested in those overlaps. So we are a part of that trend of thinking about it more holistically in relation to WASH. And I should, before I go further, say that in this presentation, the definition of gender and how it's described is slightly narrow in that it's mostly focused on the relationship between women and men. In the fund so far, that's mostly how it's been seen. The term means many other things, and in terms of transgender, in terms of sexual orientation, and so that's going to be another area for us to explore further, but is not central to the way this presentation is structured, as I say, which is more about women and men's relationship. So the very first civil society fund, which preceded CS WASH Fund, was from 2009 to 11. The reviews of that fund already pointed to gaps around gender equality and said that we need to really look at it at different levels. We need better gender analysis. We need to look at policy dialogue. We need to think about menstrual and reproductive hygiene. And so there was, I guess, a thinking process that then led to different ways in which gender equality was built into the current fund. So it was named as an explicit fund outcome, which means that we're looking to measure different aspects of what's achieved against it. It was an explicit focus in the visits from the MERP. The design itself notes that 90% of activities will include an explicit gender focus. And as we saw from what Bronwyn presented this morning, there are many knowledge and learning products which have been focused around this theme. So it has been embedded in some way in this fund, and then we'll go on to see how deep that took us. So what Bob tells us about an overview of different types of approaches of how gender equality has been given focus is that most dominantly CSOs have focused on women's involvement. Which is a very important step in relation to the ideas around participation and voice, and also women's reproductive health and menstrual hygiene management. Where we see maybe a bit less focus, women in technical roles, women in decision-making roles, and some use of whole-of-community approaches. And here's just a snapshot of just a few different, strategies which have been used by CSOs from the M&E note that was developed by the MERP. So they divided up the types of approaches that CSOs were taking into ones that advocate around gender equality and ones that are efforts to ensure equal access to the kinds of WASH outcomes that we're looking to achieve. So I won't speak through each of those, it's just to give a picture of some of the diversity of approaches. So then if we look at the fund level and we look collectively at what was planned at the outset of the fund, it was planned, if we take 3.66 million beneficiaries overall and we make an assumption that roughly 50% will be women and girls, we have almost 2 million women and girls who will gain access to WASH through the fund. There was if you aggregate the targets that different CSOs made on WASH committees, overall it was that 81% of those committees would have at least 50% women. And amongst 59% of those committees, women would be in technical or management roles. So these, as I say, it's an aggregation of what each individual CSO committed to. And the last kind of quantitative indicator was about influencing gender policies in WASH-related institutions. And these could be small institutions, big institutions, there's a mixture, but that close to 200 institutions would be doing their work differently as a result of the fund. And then using fund language around expected changes in change agents, a lot of commitments were made around changing the capacity, changing the ways in which change agents would relate to gender and social inclusion. And so to unpack those 77 changes a little further, we see an interesting pattern, I think, that's worth reflecting on. So the graph on the right shows you that most of the expected changes in relation to change agents were about taking a more gender-sensitive approach, which is great. That's definitely a step that I think we would all be in support of. A smaller number of them were about the influence of women in planning and implementation. And then perhaps the one that's not a concern, but it's definitely somewhere where we might want to think differently in the future, is a small number of expected changes around gender roles and status. So an example of gender-sensitive approach and promoting that is one from Plan. It's about promoting amongst sub-district teams for sanitation. They're integrating the gender equality objectives into their work. And one from United Purpose in Malawi, where they were looking at use of menstrual hygiene guidelines, and then adherence to those guidelines is being monitored and reported. So there's the types of expected changes that CSO is committed to, and there are 75 others of that type. So if we switch now to look at what outcomes were achieved against what was planned, this is the picture at the moment in terms of the WASH committees. So that has been very central, I'd say, to the fund, is thinking about gender in relation to WASH committees. And what we can see is that that target was maybe a stretch target. It actually hasn't been as easy to achieve as perhaps was anticipated. And that's a question then for us to reflect on this week, and particularly in the session this afternoon. What are the barriers? What are the different strategies that we could use to shift this so that we are able to have a greater proportion of women in WASH committees, given the large evidence base about the importance and value of that for many reasons. In terms of women in technical and management roles, here it looks like to date already slightly surpassed the target and projected to be even more. So that's another interesting reflection, that we do have women in technical and management roles, and that has been possible to achieve. And then lastly, that for the large part, the gender policy and influencing gender policies has been able to be achieved, but not quite at the level that was planned. So then in terms of the expected changes, so to date, it's not the end of the fund, so we don't know what the ultimate outcomes will be that will come over the next year or two. But for the reporting that's been done to date, in terms of the performance questions and responses about what changes have been seen, a large majority of achievements that are described in the reporting are simply about that many people have been trained. We'll have the number of people who have been trained, who's been trained, how they've been trained, but doesn't go to that next level of, so what? We've trained, but how do we know what's changed as a result of that training? There was, amongst some of the reported changes, some CSOs started reporting, what those trained people were doing, but often it was just that they were doing more training. So we're still, I guess, unclear about ultimately what difference is being made. And it's an area, I guess, for us to think about what kind of monitoring and evaluation systems can help us understand the outcomes of this type of training. An interesting area is that we had those quantitative targets around the WASH committees, and amongst the responses to questions, it seems clear that having those targets, which some people will say that's a good thing to have those targets, other people will say yes, but it doesn't matter. You don't want to just count the number of women on the committee, because what if they're just there and they have no voice, or what if they're there and they don't want to be there? What if there's so many possibilities? But it does seem that having those targets and quotas for many CSOs has been a point of leverage. It's been a point to have conversations about, and that's been important. So I think that's one of the powerful things about quantitative data or targets, is that it can provoke certain conversations and certain progress in certain areas. Amongst the responses, there's also, in places, a couple responses where changes in men's attitude is discussed, and also observations that we need to think much more about how we engage with men in relation to gender and WASH. Lastly, many achievements in the menstrual hygiene area, both at a practical level, also more strategic level. There's a whole session focused on that, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail. But it definitely, as per that first graph with the approaches in the fund, it's definitely been an area of focus for many CSOs. And I think, the fund, if we think about globally, new thinking around menstrual hygiene management, the fund has been at the leading edge of that amongst other global actors who are trying to give more focus to menstrual hygiene. So just a few examples of changes in gender dynamics. This is a long quote, but I couldn't decide which part of it to miss out because it covered so many different bases. So it's from Save the Children in Myanmar, and it's a woman who experienced being involved in a water supply project and gender training. And so she talks about changing confidence for herself. She talks about that normally women and girls are only allowed to participate in social occasions of joy and grief, but not involved in decision making. And then she goes on to talk about what participation meant, seeing changes in the character of the men, and that the men being more willing to discuss and work together with women. So it covers many aspects of gender in relation to voice, which, as I say, is an important part, remains an important part for us to think about in terms of gender and WASH. This second example is more about changes of working through a change agent. So this is about SMV developing an evidence base, looking at 3 districts in Nepal, and looking at then taking that evidence base. How is gender and social inclusion included in our sanitation strategies? How could it be better included? Incorporating those findings into district level strategies, and then that flowing on to increased engagement of women and people living with a disability, and also a female-led district sanitation campaign. So that to me demonstrates kind of working at a more systemic level on how you can provoke wider change by working in relation to government systems and bringing gender into those systems. And then the last example is in the private sector, which I think will also be discussed more this afternoon in one of the sessions from IDE, who have given focus to their sales agents or sanitation teachers and thinking about, well, what are the work conditions that will work for women, and modifying the way things were structured to make sure that we're able to attract and support women in these roles and being able to be involved in those businesses, not just men, and giving specific attention to that. So the fund has also given attention to thinking about, well, how do you monitor changes in relation to gender and WASH? And these, again, are just 3 examples. There are many others I've already seen. Chose them, they highlight different aspects. So Plans tool is about creating dialogue between women and men about changes in gender dynamics, changes in the power relations between women and men, and how those are happening over time. The Live and Learn example is the use of something called a participation ladder, which is from women or men, could be either, perhaps starting off only participating in a meeting by being there, to greater levels of involvement and decision making, and being able to look at that over time. So how has a particular person's participation changed over time? And then the IRC example, which I think also will be discussed, looks into, if we think about and find out about women's priorities in relation to environmental health, and if we also do the same about men's priorities, and then we look at decisions that are ultimately made by the combination of women and men, whose priorities get decided upon? What is the relative influence of women and men's priorities once we combine into a shared decision-making process? So each of these tools focuses on different aspects. There are many other aspects also to monitor that we could think about. So that gives a bit of an overview of some of the achievements and some of the ways in which gender is being addressed. For me, I was left still with many questions, and there's so many things that we don't know in this domain. So these are just a few questions. I could have filled this slide with too many. So the first one, what do we know about women's workload and whether we've actually increased it and made things more difficult or harder for women in our efforts to empower? And are we able to answer that question in relation to the different projects in the fund? Another question, there are various stories and experiences of single individuals, such as the one I described from Myanmar, but how widespread are they? Is that just one case, or is that a whole village and it's every single woman and it's every single man? And do we have a sense, really, and are we monitoring at scale to understand frequency of these kinds of changes? Do we know enough about men's perspective and how to influence those? Question I posed earlier. And a big question is about what difference does it make if we increase women's participation? What difference does it make to WASH outcomes? So there is an evidence base of many studies about how sustainability can be improved, or various aspects of how WASH outcomes can be improved, but we don't know if that's all happens all the time everywhere. And also, what difference does it make to gender equality more broadly is a question that probably most of us are not really able to answer in relation to projects in the fund. So as I said, there is evidence on some questions. So this is an example of some very recent evidence from Vanuatu, which looked into, depending on which roles women took in committees, could you see differences in sustainability? And this graph shows on the left, at the top left, is when you don't have any women in committees and you have just fee collection is much lower than on the right-hand side when you do have women in key positions in committees. And as Mark pointed out and Bronwyn reiterated, we know that these cycles of functionality and sustainability in relation to water systems are very dependent on these critical things such as fee collection. So we do have evidence base, for instance, that's Vanuatu's experience. We don't know across the board in different places what difference having women involved in different aspects of WASH management is, and there's definitely more to learn. So the question is, what else could this field of gender and development, people have been thinking about women's empowerment, gender equality, and they do that for their day job, and how can we use that theory to help us to see the world differently? So this quote, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. So we are all limited in our capacity in terms of what we view and what we notice, what we don't notice. And how can ideas and frameworks from the field of gender equality help us see differently, open up our eyes to things that we might not be noticing? Because the difficult thing with gender equality is that it's so embedded in each of us, depending on our backgrounds, what we think is normal and what we notice, that sometimes we don't notice things that actually are going to be very important. So where that points us to for the future, or for now, is to think much more about use of gender analysis. And there are many, and this is where it gets tricky, because there are so many ways that you can look at this issue. I'm going to touch on just a couple, but ultimately it's about matching the kinds of frameworks that exist in that world of gender equality to the types of work that people are doing in WASH to work out that match. So the one down the bottom, Moses framework, is about practical and strategic changes, and it's probably the one that's been most used already in the WASH sector, where the practical changes are ones that relate to women and girls' practical needs, which might be menstrual hygiene, which might be to do with maternal health, for instance, so needs that relate to their current roles. Yeah, I guess another common one that's discussed is collecting water. So when we have a water system, women's normal work of collecting water is relieved, and that's a practical change. But the question is, does that then translate, or what's the relationship of that to a strategic change, which is, okay, a woman no longer needs to collect water, but is she able to choose what that extra time is spent on? Or is that something that's imposed upon her? What does it mean for the power relations between women and men? So Moser is one view. Some people criticise it and say that you can't separate these two. They're interrelated, and when you deal with practical needs, automatically you're starting to empower and to change gender dynamics. And so other people developing such theory have started other types of frameworks that are more about control over decisions or access to different forms of resources. And the one that's here, the green one, Kabir's, is specifically about the power relations between women and men. And it says that we need to look at those in the state and how it functions. We need to look at in the markets and the private sector and how it functions. We need to look at community level. We need to look at it within families. We need to look at it within individuals. So it can get very complex, yes? So you end up with many, many, many layers to look at, to think about how roles, resources, responsibilities are shared. And what you might feel is a bit like this, you know, it's hard, there's too many things to think about, and it's really complicated. And so just to put it in simple terms, when you're doing gender analysis, you're asking simple questions like, who does what? Who has what? Who decides? How's it decided? And who gains, who loses? And then you can't forget in that, are we talking about which women and which men? Because we know that there are many other layers of inequality, not just gender equality. So those are hopefully a cut through of the complexity of gender frameworks. I think we can and we should be using them and embracing them and learning from them, but we also need to keep things manageable. And so if simple questions are a starting point, then these ones might be helpful. And things to note, asking questions in this domain is not just a technical process, okay? We're talking about power, it becomes immediately political. And even the way in which questions are asked, the framing of them, etc., you're starting to change gender dynamics just by asking a question. So the second point, it needs cultural sensitivity, okay? It needs to be built on the basis of a given culture and develop, like the way a gender analysis is done should be developed in a country context that's in relation to that context as it stands. The third point, that it needs attitude change and commitment. And this, I think, is a question of, well, say we as CSOs or change agents, who are we in our own personal lives in relation to gender equality? Who are we as organisations? How do we support men? How do we support women? What are women and men's relative roles, decision-making power in our organisations? So having that look at self, perhaps, before and during, looking at the different development contexts in which we work. And the responses then will include both mainstreaming, which is about thinking about gender equality in relation to all existing activities and how they might impact women or men differently, and how we can take that into account in every activity. Or it might mean targeting, which is we develop specific activities, specific efforts, specific strategies, which are to focus on particular groups, because we know that's what we'll need to make change. So a last kind of technical slide, getting towards the end here. This framework is one that's been developed around looking at the monitoring gender outcomes in relation to water and sanitation programming. It comes from a paper which synthesised what existing evidence do we have in the WASH sector about gender outcomes. And the dimensions are, I think, are helpful. So in the horizontal, we have that we need to think about self and individuals. So gender equality is about power relationships. And so the power that someone feels to do something or within themselves, so things like self-confidence, is a really important dimension. And we also need to think about relationships and how humans relate to one another. And then across ways we have the household, the community level, and then governance, institutions and workplaces. And I guess what the example on the right tells us, so women's participation, this is an example from literature from a while ago, was that women's participation did not contribute to enhanced negotiation power in the household, whereas often that's assumed, and the time that they gained wasn't used to support their economic independence, that they would follow their husband's preference. So it points to us needing to really think about there's changes in relationships in the bottom left, the household level, which is one we haven't delved into much in the WASH sector. There is some emerging research, which I think East Meets West will present today on household decision making. But I think this bottom left is somewhere we could think about focusing and learning, and also the far right in terms of women in government institutions, women in the private sector, as well as community-based organisations, so that broader institutional environment. So in conclusion, the ultimate target that we're looking for here, and which hopefully can be part of the Future Fund, but also part of efforts in this last stage of the CS WASH Fund, is to try and set up helpful synergies between increased gender equality and better WASH. And we know that these two are interrelated and that we can support that cycle, but we need to think probably a bit more systematically about how we do that. And it won't just focusing on women's involvement in WASH committees might not be enough. We need to think about the many other angles and intersections between the two sectors. Thank you.